The carriage accident had taken them both in one rain-soaked evening. Father and son, duke and heir. 8 months later, the loss still hung over Northmoor like a storm cloud that refused to move. And now, in the gray light of early morning, another death seemed close at hand. Clara Brennan stood hidden beneath the stone arch of the stables, her breath shallow, her hands clenched in her worn skirt. In the paddock ahead, Tempest reared high, his black body cutting sharply against the pale sky. His scream tore through the air, wild and broken, filled with pain that had nowhere to go. The new Duke of Northmoor stood alone before him. Callum Ridley moved slowly, carefully, as if every step might be his last. He held out one gloved hand, his posture tense but pleading, like a man approaching a loaded gun. Mud stained his boots. His shoulders were stiff with grief and exhaustion. "Easy, boy," he said softly. "It's me. You know me." Tempest did not know him. The stallion struck the ground with violent force. Dirt flew. His ears flattened, his eyes white and rolling. Clara recognized the signs at once. Her father had taught her how to read them when she was still a girl. This was not rage alone. This was mourning. The Duke was not training the horse. He was standing too close to his own loss. Clara should not have been there. The head groom had warned her the day before when he caught her watching. "His Grace doesn't need gawkers," he had snapped, "especially not while he's handling his brother's horse." But Clara had not been gawking. She had been watching, reading, seeing what others refused to see. Tempest screamed again and rose onto his hind legs. Callum stumbled backward, his heel catching on a stone slick with mud. He fell hard to the ground. Time seemed to stop. The horse came down fast, too fast. Clara did not think. She moved. She vaulted the paddock fence without hesitation, skirts tearing, boots hitting dirt as she landed between the fallen Duke and the grieving stallion. Tempest's hooves struck inches from Callum's shoulder. Clara did not scream. She did not run. She stood very still and began to hum. It was not a song. It was only a low, steady sound, shaped by her breath, slow, even, calm. Her father had taught her this. You do not force peace on a frightened animal. You offer it and wait. Tempest froze. His head turned toward her. His nostrils flared as he tested her scent. Clara kept humming, kept breathing. Behind her, she heard Callum scramble to his feet. She did not turn. "You miss him," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum. "I know you do." Tempest's ears shifted, just slightly. One ear tipped forward, as if listening. It was enough. Clara took one careful step closer, then another. The stallion did not retreat. His breath warmed her outstretched palm. "What do you think you're doing?" Callum shouted. The sharp sound startled Tempest. Clara lifted her hand in a firm, commanding motion. Silence. To Callum's shock, he obeyed. The Duke of Northmoor stood quiet because a horse trainer's daughter had told him to. Only when Tempest's breathing slowed did Clara turn. Callum stood several feet away, his riding coat smeared with mud, his dark hair fallen loose across his brow. His gray eyes were wide, filled with fear and something else she refused to name. "You could have been killed," he said. "So could you," Clara replied. "That's different." "No," she said, "it isn't." The words slipped out sharper than she intended. Pride was dangerous, but she was tired of swallowing it. Tempest stood behind her now, watchful but calmer, as if guarding her.
"You calmed him," Callum said quietly.
In seconds. "I didn't calm him," Clara answered. "I stopped being a threat." Callum looked back at the horse. His jaw tightened. "My brother raised him from a foal," he said. He would follow Edmund anywhere. After the accident, I thought he would accept me, that he would understand I'm not the one he's waiting for. The grief in his voice was bare. "I can't destroy him," Callum continued, "but keeping him like this is cruelty. Every trainer says he's beyond help." Clara turned to Tempest. She saw no madness there, only loss. "He's not gone," she said. He's alone. Callum looked at her sharply. Can you help him? She knew what he was truly asking. Can you save the last piece of my brother I have left? She should have said no. She had debts waiting at home, creditors circling her father's land like vultures, a broken engagement behind her, a reputation already bruised by gossip. Instead, she said, I can try. Relief crossed his face so fast it startled her. Name your price. 3 weeks, Clara said. Full control, no interference. And payment enough to keep my home. Done. And a written reference when I succeed, she added. Callum hesitated only a moment. Done. She nodded once. I start tomorrow. You start now, he said. He ordered rooms prepared near the stables, insisted she stay close, said Tempest needed consistency. Clara knew the truth. The Duke needed it too. That night, Clara stood alone in her borrowed room, staring at clean linens and polished wood she had never known. Her own cottage waited miles away, drafty and fragile, filled with her father's memory and unpaid bills. She could not lose it. Near midnight, a sound rose across the estate. Tempest screamed. Clara was out the door before she fully woke. The stables glowed with lamplight. Callum stood outside the stall, shirt sleeves rolled up, his face pale. He does this every night, he said. Nothing helps. I'm going in, Clara said. He's dangerous. So is grief. She entered the stall and sat in the corner, knees drawn up. She did not touch the horse. She did not speak at first. She waited. Tempest paced and cried, his pain raw and endless. Clara let it exist. After a long while, she spoke. My father died 3 years ago, she said softly. I kept setting his place at the table. The heart doesn't listen to reason. Tempest slowed. You're allowed to miss him, she whispered. You don't have to be alone anymore. The stallion stopped, trembling. Then, slowly, he stepped closer. When Clara reached out this time, Tempest did not strike. He let her touch him. Outside the stall, Callum watched in silence, hope and fear battling in his chest. For the first time since the accident, Tempest did not scream himself into exhaustion. And for the first time in 8 months, the Duke of Northmoor allowed himself to believe that something broken might still be saved. Morning came gray and cold, but the stables were already awake. Clara rose before dawn, pulling on her plain dress and boots, her father's worn training journal tucked under her arm. She moved quietly, aware that every step she took on ducal land was being watched, judged, and whispered about. Tempest stood waiting when she reached his stall. His ears flicked toward her, not flat this time, not hostile, just aware. That's good, she murmured. Awareness means you're still here. She did not rush him. She cleaned his stall herself, spoke softly as she worked, let him see that she came without demands. When she finished, she simply stood near the door and breathed. From the corridor, Callum watched. He had slept little. The image of Clara sitting in the stall with Tempest through the midnight storm of grief had not left him. He had seen trainers command horses. He had never seen someone listen to. One. You don't need to hover, Clara said without turning. He knows you're there. Callum stopped short. I wasn't hovering. She glanced back at him, one brow lifting. You were. Despite himself, he almost smiled. Over the next days, word spread through the estate. The dangerous horse no longer screamed at dawn. He allowed his halter to be fitted. He followed Clara into the paddock without striking out. Servants whispered, stable hands stared. Some crossed themselves when Tempest obeyed her voice. It isn't magic, Clara told them when she caught the looks. It's patience. But patience was not what Lord Victor Ashworth believed in. He arrived on the 5th morning with polished boots, an easy smile, and eyes that measured everything. He leaned against the paddock fence, watching Clara guide Tempest through slow circles. So this is the miracle worker, he said lazily. Clara did not stop. And you are? Victor Ashworth, he replied, the Duke's cousin. She nodded once. Good morning. Is it? He asked. My understanding was that this horse tried to kill 3 men and a duke. He was grieving, Clara said. Grief looks frightening when people don't understand it. Victor laughed softly. You speak as if animals think like humans. They feel like humans, she said. Which is more important? His smile thinned. You're very confident for someone of your position. She finally turned to face him. And you're very curious for someone who claims no responsibility here. Victor's eyes sharpened. Careful. Likewise, she replied. From the manor window, Callum saw the exchange. His jaw tightened. That night, Tempest cried again. Softer this time. Clara sat with him, her back against the wall, humming quietly. The stallion rested his head near her shoulder, not touching, but close enough to share warmth. Callum stood at the stall door. You don't have to stay, she said. I know. He stayed anyway. They did not speak much those nights. There was something fragile growing between them, something both of them feared naming. Shared silence felt safer than promises. By the end of the first week, Tempest accepted a saddle. By the end of the second, he walked calmly beside Callum without lashing out. Hope crept into the stables like sunlight. That was when everything went wrong. Clara arrived one morning to find Tempest wild-eyed and sweating. His muscles shook. His breathing was wrong. She knelt by the water bucket and smelled it. Her blood ran cold. Fetch the Duke, she ordered the stable hand. Now. Callum came running, his coat half-fastened. He's been drugged, Clara said. Not enough to kill him. Enough to make him dangerous. Victor's face flashed in her mind. They worked fast. Fresh water. Slow walking. Clara never left Tempest's side, even when his legs buckled. Someone is trying to make him fail, Callum said quietly. Yes, Clara replied. And tomorrow is the council demonstration. Callum swore under his breath. That night, Clara slept in the stables. Callum stayed too. 2 lanterns burned low as they sat on opposite sides of the stall, listening to Tempest breathe. You shouldn't have to risk this, Callum said. And you shouldn't have to lose everything because someone is cruel, she replied. Their eyes met in the dim light. Something shifted. Clara, he said softly. Don't, she whispered, but it was already too late. The demonstration day arrived bright and unforgiving. The council gathered, guests whispered. Victor smiled. Clara led Tempest into the paddock, her heart pounding. The horse fought the lingering effects of the drug, but he trusted her. She mounted. For 3 seconds, it worked. Then Tempest bucked. Gasps filled the air. Clara rode through fear and instinct, holding until she knew she could not save it. She jumped clear, hit the ground hard, rolled, and lay still. Callum was over the fence before anyone could stop him. Clara, he said, lifting her head, speak to me. I'm here, she gasped. Victor stepped forward. Well, that settles it. Something inside Callum broke. No, he said. It doesn't. He stood, his hand clasping Clara's. You see danger, he told the council. I see sabotage. I see grief turned into a weapon. And I see a woman who risked her life because she believes broken things are worth saving. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Victor sneered. You're compromised. Callum looked down at Clara, then back at them. Then let me be compromised, he said. Because I refuse to become a man who destroys what he loves to appear strong. Silence fell. Tempest stepped forward. Slowly, calmly. He lowered his head and pressed it against Callum's chest. A collective breath was released. Lord Hardwicke stared. That horse has never done that. He's healing, Clara said quietly. Victor's face went pale. The council withdrew to speak in private. When they returned, their tone had changed. We will investigate, Hardwicke said, both the sabotage and the accusations. Victor said nothing. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Callum turned to Clara, his voice low. I should have protected you better. She shook her head. You stood when it mattered.
I meant before. Their hands lingered together.
That night, under the quiet stars, Tempest rested peacefully for the first time in months. And Clara realized she was no longer just saving a horse. She was standing in the middle of a choice that would change everything. The investigation did not take long. Truth has a way of surfacing when enough people are watching closely. The stable hand who had been paid to look the other way spoke within 2 days. The drug was traced, the timing exposed, and Lord Victor Ashworth's polite smile vanished from Northmoor for good. He left the estate quietly before the council's final ruling could be announced. By the end of the week, word reached the servants that he would not be returning. Clara heard the news while brushing Tempest in the early morning light. The stallion stood calm and steady, his head lowered, his breathing slow. He no longer startled at footsteps. He no longer screamed at midnight. "He's different," the head groom said, awe in his voice. "Never seen a horse come back from something like that." Clara ran the brush down Tempest's dark neck. "He didn't come back," she said. He moved forward. The council's decision was delivered to Callum in the library. Clara waited outside, pacing the long corridor, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. She told herself she was calm. She told herself she had done her part. When the doors finally opened, Callum stepped out alone. For one terrible second, she thought she had lost everything. Then he smiled. "They're standing down," he said. No censure, no interference, and a formal apology. Her knees weakened. Truly, truly. He moved closer, lowering his voice. "They also recommended Tempest remain under your care." Relief rushed through her so hard it hurt. "That means," Callum continued, "if you wish to stay." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, the Duke who had stood in public scandal, the man who had chosen honesty over safety. "I do," she said softly, "if the offer still stands." It always stood. In the weeks that followed, life at Northmoor changed in small but meaningful ways. Callum spent more time in the stables than the drawing rooms. The servants relaxed. Laughter returned to halls long ruled by silence, and Clara became impossible to ignore. She trained horses. She spoke plainly. She refused to bow her head when dismissed opinions were offered. People talked. They always would. Callum stopped caring. One evening, as autumn crept into the air, he found Clara sitting on the fence watching Tempest graze. "He's ready," she said without looking at him. "For what?" "To be ridden properly again, not to perform, just to live." Callum swallowed. "I was afraid to ask." "You don't have to ride him," she said gently, "but I think he's ready for you." They approached together. Tempest did not move away. Callum laid a hand against the horse's neck, his breath unsteady. For a long moment he said nothing. "I miss him," he whispered, "every day." Tempest nudged his shoulder, solid and warm. "So do I," Clara said. Callum turned to her then. The question in his eyes was not about horses. "I can't offer you safety," he said, "or ease, or a quiet life." "I don't want quiet," she replied. "I can offer honesty," he continued, "and partnership, and a place beside me that won't always be welcomed by others." She smiled sadly. "I've never been welcomed. I've survived anyway." He laughed softly. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't," she said, "but it's worth choosing." He took her hands. No crowd, no counsel, just truth. "Stay," he said, "not as an employee, as my equal." Her heart ached with the weight of it. "Yes," she said. The engagement was announced weeks later. The reaction was exactly what Clara expected. Shock, disapproval, endless whispers. And yet, letters arrived too, from women who had married for love and endured. From men who admired Callum's defiance. From people who had felt unseen and suddenly felt braver. The wedding was small. No grand society spectacle. No performances. Tempest stood near the chapel, calm and proud, as if he understood the day mattered. When Clara walked down the aisle, she wore no borrowed jewels, only her father's simple silver pin at her collar. Callum watched her as if the world had narrowed to one point. "I choose you," he said in his vows, "not despite who you are, because of it." "I choose you," she answered, "not for your title, for your courage." Afterward, they walked the grounds together, hands linked, breathing in the quiet they had earned. That night, Clara returned to the stables one last time as Clara Brennan. Callum followed her. "You don't have to say goodbye," he said. "I know," she replied. "I just want to remember." Tempest lifted his head and walked to her. She pressed her forehead to his. "You did good," she whispered. "We both did." The horse breathed out slow and steady. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the fields. The estate changed its rhythm, and one morning Clara woke with Callum's hand warm against her back and realized she was no longer afraid of tomorrow. Months later, when their daughter was born, Tempest stood quietly outside the window, a dark shape against the white ground. Callum held the child and laughed through tears. "She's stubborn," he said. Clara smiled. "She'll need to be." They named her Margaret for healing and memory. Years later, people would still tell the story about the Duke's most dangerous horse, about the quiet woman who stepped forward. But Clara knew the truth. The horse was never dangerous. He was broken. And love, chosen bravely and without apology, had taught them all how to heal.